The autumn wind carried the scent of burning grass across the Dakota Territory as Sarah Running Bear pressed her back against the rough bark of an oak tree. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. In the distance, she could hear the thunder of horses' hooves and the wild shouts of men who had already taken too much from her people. At 17, Sarah had seen more violence than most women twice her age. Her village had been peaceful just 3 days ago. Children played near the river while their mothers prepared winter meat and their fathers crafted weapons for the upcoming hunt. The Lakota had lived in this valley for generations, following the buffalo and respecting the land that provided everything they needed. But peace was a luxury that white settlers seemed determined to steal. The raiders had come at dawn, their faces painted with greed instead of honor. They wanted the horses, the furs, and most of all, they wanted the land. Sarah's father, Chief White Hawk, had tried to negotiate. He spoke of treaties and promises made by men in Washington. The raiders laughed and fired their guns into the air. Sarah's mother had grabbed her daughter's hand during the chaos. "Run to the hills," she whispered urgently. "Find somewhere safe until this madness passes." Those were the last words Sarah heard from her mother before a bullet found its mark and the woman who had taught her to weave baskets and identify healing plants fell to the ground like a broken wing. Now Sarah ran through unfamiliar territory, her moccasins silent on the forest floor. She had been trained to move without leaving tracks, to read the signs that nature provided and to survive in the wilderness. But this was different. This was not a hunting expedition or a journey to gather herbs. This was pure survival, with death chasing her on horseback. The sound of horses grew louder. Sarah could hear individual voices now, rough men calling to each other in English. Her father had made sure she learned the white man's language, believing it would help his people navigate the changing world. Now that knowledge might save her life, but it also meant she could understand every cruel word the raiders shouted about what they planned to do with any survivors they found. Through the trees ahead, Sarah spotted something that made her pause. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and she could see the outline of a simple wooden house with a barn nearby, a white man's home. Her first instinct was to run in the opposite direction. White settlers had brought nothing but trouble to her people. Yet as the sound of pursuing horses grew closer, she realized she had few choices. Sarah approached the house carefully, moving from tree to tree like a deer approaching a water hole. She could see a man working near the barn, tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and clothes that spoke of hard work rather than wealth. He moved with the steady rhythm of someone accustomed to physical labor, stacking firewood with practiced efficiency. The thunder of hooves was getting closer. Sarah could hear the raiders calling to each other, spreading out to search the forest. Her time was running out. She stepped into the clearing, her hands visible and empty, approaching the way her father had taught her to approach any potentially dangerous situation with dignity and caution. The white man looked up as she emerged from the trees. His eyes took in her traditional dress, the fear in her face, and the way she kept glancing back toward the forest. He had kind eyes, Sarah noticed, not the cold, calculating look she had seen in the raiders' faces. Deep lines around those eyes spoke of years spent outdoors, probably watching over cattle and crops. "Please," Sarah said in English, her voice barely above a whisper. The word felt strange on her tongue, this language of treaties and broken promises. But desperation made her continue. "May I remain here until the raiders pass?" She stood perfectly still, waiting for his answer. Behind her, the sound of horses grew closer, and she could hear men shouting questions to each other about tracks and hiding places. Her whole future balanced on this moment, on the decision of a stranger whose people had already taken so much from hers. The rancher looked at her for what felt like an eternity. His gaze moved from her face to the forest behind her, and she knew he could hear the approaching danger as clearly as she could. She watched his jaw tighten as he seemed to weigh his options. Helping her could bring trouble to his own doorstep. These raiders would not hesitate to burn down his house and barn if they thought he was harboring their prey. But something in his expression told Sarah that this man understood what it meant to face impossible choices. His weathered hands paused in their work, and she saw him glance toward his house. Perhaps thinking of his own family, his own reasons for being in this remote place far from civilization. The rancher set down the piece of wood he had been holding. Without saying a word, he simply nodded. One small movement of his head that meant the difference between life and death for a Lakota girl whose world had just been destroyed by men who looked exactly like him. The rancher's nod sent a wave of relief through Sarah's body, but she knew they had only seconds before the raiders emerged from the tree line. Without hesitation, the man motioned toward his barn, his movements quick but calm. He had clearly faced danger before and knew how to think under pressure. "Behind the hay bales," he said quietly, leading her toward the large wooden structure. "Stay down and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Sarah followed him into the barn, breathing in the familiar smell of horses and hay that reminded her painfully of her own village. The rancher guided her to a corner where several large bales created a natural hiding space. As she crouched down, he tossed a horse blanket over the opening, making it look like just another pile of supplies. "My name is Thomas," he whispered before turning away. "Stay quiet and trust me." Sarah pressed herself against the hay, her body trembling not from cold but from the shock of everything that had happened. 3 days ago, she had been helping her grandmother prepare medicine for the winter months. Now she was hiding in a white man's barn, completely dependent on the kindness of a stranger while killers searched for her with loaded guns. The sound of horses entered the yard with a thunder that made the barn walls shake. Sarah could hear at least 6 or 7 animals, their hooves stamping impatiently as their riders surveyed the property. Through a small gap in the hay, she could see slivers of sunlight and shadow moving across the barn floor. "Afternoon," came Thomas's voice, steady and casual as if he were greeting neighbors at a church social instead of facing armed raiders. Sarah was amazed by his composure. Her own heart was beating so loud she was certain the horses outside could hear it. "We're tracking a savage that came this way," a harsh voice replied. Sarah recognized it as belonging to the man who had been shouting orders during the attack on her village. "Young squaw, probably armed and dangerous. You seen anything suspicious?" Sarah's hands clenched into fists at the word savage. Her people had names, families, traditions that went back countless generations. They had medicine and stories and art that these men would never understand. But she forced herself to remain silent, knowing that her anger would not help her survive. "Haven't seen anyone all day," Thomas replied, his voice carrying just the right amount of helpful concern. "Been working on winter preparations since dawn. You boys look like you've had a hard ride. Welcome to water your horses if you need." The offer was brilliant, Sarah realized. It made Thomas seem like a helpful neighbor, while also giving the raiders a reason to stay in the open yard instead of searching the buildings. She could hear water splashing and horses drinking, the sound mixing with the low conversation of the men. "This savage killed 3 of our people," another voice added, younger and more aggressive than the leader. "We ain't stopping until we find her." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. She had not killed anyone. She had been running for her life while her village burned, too focused on survival to fight back. The accusation was a lie, probably invented to justify their hunt or to encourage others to join their cause. "That's terrible," Thomas said, his voice carrying appropriate sympathy. "You check the river bottom? Lots of good hiding places down that way, and it leads toward the reservation." Sarah almost smiled despite her fear. Thomas was sending them in completely the wrong direction, toward lands that were miles away from where she actually intended to go. His suggestion sounded helpful and knowledgeable, exactly what the raiders would expect from a local rancher. "Good thinking," the leader replied. "We'll check it out. But we might need to search some of these buildings first. Can't be too careful." Sarah's blood turned to ice. This was the moment she had been dreading. If they searched the barn, they would find her within minutes. She pressed herself deeper into the hay, trying to become invisible while her mind raced through possible escape routes. There was a back door to the barn, but reaching it would mean crossing open space where she could easily be seen. "Of course," Thomas replied without hesitation. "Though I should mention, I've got a bull in the back stall that's been ornery all week, injured his leg, and he's not happy about it. You might want to be careful if you check back there." Another clever deflection, Sarah realized. Thomas was making the search seem dangerous and inconvenient without actually refusing to cooperate. She could hear footsteps approaching the barn, heavy boots on hard-packed earth. The barn door creaked as it opened wider. Sarah could see shadows moving across the floor, and she held her breath as footsteps approached her hiding place. Her whole body was rigid with tension, every muscle prepared to run or fight if she was discovered. "Lot of places to hide in here," one of the raiders commented. His voice was close, maybe 10 feet from where Sarah crouched behind the hay. "Sure is," Thomas agreed, walking alongside them. "Though most of it's just winter feed and equipment. Haven't had time to organize it proper since harvest." Sarah could hear them moving around the barn, checking stalls and poking at piles of equipment. Each footstep seemed to echo like thunder in her ears. She tried to make herself as small as possible, thinking of the lessons her grandmother had taught her about patience and stillness when hunting. "What's behind here?" The voice was directly in front of her hiding place. Sarah's heart stopped. Through the tiny gap in the hay, she could see a pair of dirty boots just inches away. A hand reached toward the horse blanket that concealed her hiding spot. This was the end. She would be discovered, and Thomas would probably be killed for helping her. But then a loud crash echoed from the back of the barn, followed by an angry bellow that sounded like it came from the most aggressive bull in the territory. "Told you he was ornery," Thomas said calmly. "Sounds like he just kicked over his water trough. He's been doing that all week." The footsteps moved quickly away from Sarah's hiding place, heading toward the back of the barn to investigate the noise. She realized that Thomas had somehow created a distraction, probably by throwing something or disturbing the animal himself while the raiders were focused on searching. "Let's check the house," the leader called out. "This barn's just full of farm junk anyway." Sarah remained perfectly still as the sounds of the search moved away from her. Through her peephole in the hay, she watched shadows move across the floor as the raiders left the barn. But she knew this was far from over. They would search Thomas's house, and they might come back to the barn for a more thorough look. The next hour stretched like an entire season for Sarah as she listened to the raiders tear through Thomas's house. She could hear furniture being moved, doors slamming, and occasional shouts as the men grew frustrated with their fruitless search. Each sound made her wince, knowing that Thomas was watching strangers violate his home because he had chosen to help her. Through her hiding place, Sarah caught glimpses of Thomas moving around the yard, maintaining his helpful facade while the raiders ransacked his property. She watched him point toward different areas, continuing to offer suggestions about where a fleeing person might hide, always directing them away from the barn. His calmness under pressure reminded her of her father during tribal negotiations, steady and thoughtful even when facing hostile opponents. "This is taking too long," she heard the leader announce as the men emerged from the house. "Sun's getting low and that savage could be miles away by now." "What about checking the storm cellar?" suggested the young, aggressive voice. "Or maybe the well house?" Sarah tensed as she realized they were not ready to give up. These men had invested too much energy in their hunt to walk away empty-handed. Through her small viewing space, she could see Thomas nodding thoughtfully, as if considering the suggestion. Storm cellar's been flooded since the last big rain, Thomas replied. But you're welcome to look. Well house is just tools and pump equipment, but check there too if it makes you feel better. Sarah admired his strategy. By agreeing to additional searches while providing logical reasons why they would be unsuccessful, Thomas maintained his cooperative appearance while discouraging the raiders from being too thorough. She watched him lead the men toward the storm cellar, buying her more time and keeping them away from her hiding place. While the raiders splashed around in the flooded cellar, Sarah allowed herself to think beyond the immediate danger. Even if she survived this day, what would happen next? Her village was destroyed, her family was scattered or dead, and she was alone in hostile territory with nowhere to go. The reservation was 40 miles away through dangerous country, and she had no way of knowing if any of her people had survived the attack. The sound of frustrated cursing from the storm cellar interrupted her thoughts. The raiders were clearly finding nothing but mud and stagnant water. Sarah could hear Thomas offering helpful commentary about drainage problems and suggesting they might want to check the creek bed where someone could easily hide among the willow trees. "You're awful helpful for someone whose neighbors just got murdered by savages," the young raider said suspiciously. His tone had shifted, becoming more threatening and less trusting of Thomas's cooperation. Sarah felt her stomach clench with new fear. If the raiders started suspecting Thomas of deliberately misleading them, they might decide to search more thoroughly or even harm him. She had already brought enough trouble to this kind stranger's doorstep. "Just want to see justice done," Thomas replied evenly, "and I want these murderers caught before they hurt anyone else. That's why I'm trying to help you boys think of all the places they might be hiding." His response was perfect, Sarah realized. By emphasizing his desire for justice and his concern for community safety, Thomas reinforced his image as a helpful citizen rather than someone with something to hide. The young raider seemed satisfied with this answer, and Sarah could hear the tension in his voice diminish. As afternoon faded toward evening, the raiders began to lose enthusiasm for their search. Their horses were tired, their own energy was flagging, and they had found no trace of their quarry despite searching for hours. Sarah could hear them discussing whether to make camp or continue their hunt elsewhere. "Maybe she doubled back toward the river," one of them suggested. "Could have circled around while we were searching here." "Or maybe she's already dead in the woods somewhere," added another. "Bleeding out from a wound we gave her back at the village." Sarah's jaw tightened at their casual discussion of her possible death, but she remained silent and motionless. These men saw her as nothing more than a dangerous animal to be hunted down and killed. They had no understanding of her humanity, her dreams, or the family she was mourning. "We'll check the river bottom like this gentleman suggested," the leader finally decided. "If we don't find tracks there, we'll head back to town and organize a proper search party for tomorrow." Sarah felt a mix of relief and new anxiety. Relief that they were finally leaving, but anxiety about the promised return with more men. She would not be able to hide in Thomas's barn indefinitely, and a larger search party would be much more thorough than this group had been. She listened as the raiders thanked Thomas for his cooperation and mounted their horses. The sound of hoofbeats gradually faded as they rode toward the river, following Thomas's misleading directions. But Sarah remained in her hiding place, knowing that hasty movement had killed more hunted creatures than patience ever had. Thomas entered the barn a few minutes after the sound of horses disappeared completely. Sarah could hear him moving around, doing normal evening chores, but also checking to make sure the raiders were truly gone. Only when he spoke quietly did she finally allow herself to relax. "They're gone," he said softly. "But stay hidden a bit longer. Sometimes men like that double back to check if anyone was deceiving them." Sarah was grateful for his caution. Her father had taught her that the most dangerous moment for any hunted animal was when it thought the danger had passed. Predators often waited for their prey to make exactly that mistake. 20 more minutes passed before Thomas returned to her hiding place and carefully moved the horse blanket aside. Sarah emerged from behind the hay bales like a deer stepping out of deep forest cover, her muscles stiff from remaining motionless for so long. "Thank you," she said quietly, meeting his eyes directly the way her father had taught her to address anyone she respected. "You saved my life." Thomas nodded, studying her face in the dim light of the barn. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she replied, then added in the tradition of her people, "Sarah Running Bear, daughter of Chief White Hawk of the Lakota." Recognition flickered in Thomas's eyes. "I've heard of your father. He's known as an honorable man, even among the white settlers. What happened to your village?" The question opened wounds that Sarah had been trying to keep closed during her desperate flight. For the first time since the attack, she allowed herself to remember her mother's final words, her father's attempts at peaceful negotiation, and the sound of gunfire that had destroyed everything she knew. "Raiders came at dawn 3 days ago," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "They wanted our horses and our land. My father tried to talk peace, but they weren't interested in talking." Thomas nodded grimly. "I've been hearing stories about increased raids all along the territory. Some folks are getting rich selling stolen horses and claiming bounties for Indian scalps. Makes me ashamed of my own kind." His honesty surprised Sarah. Most white people she had encountered refused to acknowledge the violence that their people were committing against the tribes. Thomas's willingness to speak truthfully about the situation made her trust him even more. As darkness settled over the ranch, Thomas led Sarah to his house for the first time. She moved carefully, still listening for any sounds that might indicate the raiders had returned, but the evening was peaceful except for the normal sounds of cattle and crickets. Inside the simple wooden structure, Sarah was surprised to find clean, well-organized rooms that spoke of a man who took care of his possessions and his home. "Sit down and rest," Thomas said, indicating a chair near his stone fireplace. "You must be exhausted and hungry." Sarah accepted his offer gratefully, sinking into the chair and feeling her muscles finally begin to relax. She had been running on fear and determination for 3 days, and the safety of this house felt like a miracle she had not dared to hope for. Thomas moved around his kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat. As he worked, Sarah studied this man who had risked his own safety to help her. His clothes were patched but clean, his movements were economical and purposeful, and his face showed the kind of weathering that came from years of honest outdoor work. "Why did you help me?" Sarah asked quietly. "Your own people would call you a traitor for protecting a Lakota." Thomas paused in his food preparation, considering the question seriously. "My wife was Cherokee," he said finally. "She died of smallpox 5 years ago, along with our 2 children." The simple statement carried enormous weight. Sarah understood immediately that Thomas had his own experience with loss and prejudice. A white man married to a Cherokee woman would have faced suspicion and hostility from many settlers, just as his family would have faced danger simply because of their mixed heritage. "I'm sorry for your loss," Sarah said, meaning it deeply. In Lakota tradition, acknowledging another person's grief was a sacred responsibility. "Mary always said that kindness was the only thing that made the world bearable," Thomas continued, placing food on the table. "She helped anyone who needed it, Indian or white, and she taught our children to see people as individuals rather than enemies." Sarah accepted the food gratefully, realizing that she had not eaten anything substantial since fleeing her village. As she ate, Thomas continued sharing his story, and Sarah began to understand why this man had been willing to risk everything to help a stranger. "After Mary and the children died, I thought about leaving the territory," Thomas admitted. "Starting over somewhere else, maybe going back east where my brother lives. But this land holds their memory. Mary's buried in the grove behind the house, next to our son and daughter." The conversation helped Sarah understand that she was not the only person who had lost everything important. Thomas's grief was older than hers, but she could see that it still shaped his decisions and his view of the world. His choice to help her was not random kindness, but a deliberate act that honored his wife's memory and values. "What will you do now?" Thomas asked gently. "Those raiders will be back tomorrow with more men, and they'll search more thoroughly." Sarah had been dreading this question, but she knew she could not avoid it forever. "I need to reach the reservation," she said. "Some of my people might have survived and made it there. But it's 40 miles through country controlled by men who want to kill me." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Traveling alone, you'd never make it. Too many ranchers and riders between here and there, and most of them are paid bounties for Indian scalps." The blunt assessment was discouraging but honest. Sarah appreciated Thomas's straightforward evaluation of her situation rather than false reassurance that would not help her survive. "I could take you," Thomas said quietly. "I've got business in the town near the reservation, been putting off the trip for weeks. We could leave before dawn, take the back trails, and be there by tomorrow night." Sarah stared at him in amazement. "That would put you in terrible danger. If anyone discovered you were helping me, they would call you an Indian lover and worse." "Let them," Thomas replied firmly. "Mary always said the world had enough hatred without adding more to it. Besides, I know those back trails better than any raider does. We can avoid the main roads and the settlements where people might ask questions." The offer was generous beyond anything Sarah had expected, but she hesitated to accept it. Thomas had already done more than enough by hiding her from the raiders. Asking him to risk a dangerous journey seemed like taking advantage of his kindness. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You've already saved my life." "This isn't about debt," Thomas replied. "It's about doing what's right. Mary would never forgive me if I sent you out there alone to face those killers." Sarah considered the offer carefully. Traveling with Thomas would certainly be safer than attempting the journey alone, but it would also put him at risk if they were caught. On the other hand, staying at the ranch was impossible now that the raiders knew the general area where she was hiding. "If we do this," Sarah said slowly, "we need to understand the dangers. If we're caught, they'll kill us both." "I understand," Thomas nodded. "But I'd rather take that risk than live with the knowledge that I sent you to die alone." Sarah looked at this remarkable man who was willing to risk everything to help someone he had met only hours ago. His offer reminded her that even in times of terrible violence and hatred, some people still chose kindness over fear. "Then I accept," she said quietly. "And I promise that someday, if I survive this, I will find a way to repay your kindness." "No repayment needed," Thomas smiled. "Mary always said that kindness was like water in a drought. You don't hoard it, you share it, and somehow there's always enough for everyone who needs it." As they planned their early morning departure, Sarah felt something she had not experienced since the attack on her village: hope. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but she would not face it alone. Thomas gathered supplies and studied maps while Sarah mended her torn clothing and prepared for the long ride ahead. Just before dawn, they mounted Thomas's 2 strongest horses and set out through the gray morning light. Sarah looked back once at the ranch that had sheltered her, knowing she would never forget the man who had chosen to see her humanity rather than her heritage. Behind them, the sun began to rise over the Dakota territory, illuminating a landscape where hatred and kindness existed side by side, and where individual choices determined whether the day would bring hope or despair. As they rode toward the reservation and an uncertain future, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that even in the darkest times, there were people like Thomas who chose to light candles rather than curse the darkness. His simple nod in response to her desperate plea had saved more than her life. It had restored her faith that goodness could survive even when surrounded by violence and fear.